If you had said to someone in the 1910s or 1920s that just 30 or 40 years into the future, there would be wars fought in the name of human rights, I think they would have been quite surprised as well. And I think the world will be transformed by the force of climate change in exactly that kind of a way, so that several decades from now, it will be impossible to think about geopolitics, to think about domestic politics, to think about economics, to think about our relationship to technology, without really first thinking about the state of the climate, because it is just that all-encompassing a system which will affect and, in most cases, damage everything about the way that we live. Now, I also, on a more encouraging front, see MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, talking about how he needs his country's economy to go entirely off oil by 2050, probably mostly off oil by 2030. And MBS is a kind of horrific figure in many, many ways and not someone you want to applaud, but that contains some real wisdom about how the world is evolving. He thinks he understands, and I hope he's right, that a decade or so down the line, a country couldn't be as dependent on oil as Saudi Arabia is today and still expect a seat at the table of nations. And what that means for the future of the world generally remains to be seen, but I think that we are moving in that direction probably quite rapidly, and we'll have to develop a kind of new politics around carbon to make sense of the new climate future that we find ourselves in, with considerably more resource scarcity, considerably larger refugee crisis, and many more challenges and threats than we can really process or imagine right now.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org, and we're continuing the conversation with David Wallace-Wells, who is a National Fellow at the New America Foundation and a columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine, and he was previously the deputy editor of the Paris Review, and his latest book just out is The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. So just let's quickly go through the alternative energies. I mean, of course, the Green New Deal is getting a lot of attention. And as we mentioned earlier, Trump has turned back the clock. This has been, 4 years, assuming he lasts 4 years. It's 4 years wasted, in effect. And, of course, he's talked about bringing back coal, which is not necessarily happening, but coal is about as bad as it gets in terms of CO2. But natural gas has been ballyhooed as the great replacement for coal because its footprint's about a half in terms of CO2. But there's an awful lot of leakage of methane associated, particularly with fracking for natural gas. And nuclear, where it doesn't have a carbon footprint, is incredibly expensive, and nobody knows quite what to do with the radioactive waste part of it. And I don't see any clamor on Wall Street to start investing in nuclear. So would you agree with that sketch of the alternatives short of the wind and solar?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general we have to probably invest some amount of money in nuclear to get those prices down. But I also think that wind and solar are quite appealing alternatives that are quite scalable and quite cheap right now. So when I look at the problem, the sort of bigger picture problem of our global carbon footprint, I don't see energy as the most problematic sector. I actually see it as the least problematic sector. I think that we probably need to do the least to get ourselves all the way to zero emissions there. And I think that market forces are sort of already driving us in that direction, even if they're not driving us there fast enough. The other sectors are more complicated. There's transportation, there's industry, there's agriculture. Each of these is much more complicated to solve than the energy problem. And in some cases, there are interventions that can be undertaken relatively soon with existing technology. In other cases, we're ways off from that. We really don't have anything like a carbon-free plane that will be available anytime soon, and we know that the world is not about to give up air travel. So where does that leave us? We can replace some of that travel with high-speed rail, but certainly not all of it. You can't go from New York to Japan on high-speed rail. And we are quite far from having planes that can take us those distances without imposing a massive carbon impact. The average round-trip flight in the U.S. from New York to Los Angeles is the equivalent of 8 months of driving, and every round-trip flight from New York to London is every seat on every flight, New York to London, melts about 3 square meters of Arctic ice. It's every single seat on every single one of those planes. Flying is really, jet travel is only 2%, I think, of the global carbon problem, but it's growing, and we don't have an easy solution to it. Some similar problems with a lot of heavy industry. Agriculture seems to me to be an area where there's some more available solutions, but even so, it's a quite thorny, complicated problem, much more thorny and more complicated than energy. And I think we really need to aggressively focus our political energy and also our R&D investments in those areas so that we can make transitions that we need to make, rather than just sort of waiting for the transitions to happen by themselves.
Well, I think transportation, in terms of its contribution to CO2, in terms of the countries that are the biggest emitters, I think the US is still number one. I think China's two. Is India three? I'm not sure. But I understand transportation itself, that includes aircraft and ships at sea, is about number 5, isn't it?
You may be right. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but that seems totally plausible to me.
Right. And it's a little ironic that people who care about global warming and meet at Davos also fly there in private jets, right?
Yeah. I think in general that we have an inclination, we have a kind of reflex. We hope to see a single silver bullet solution. We hope to see, this kind of invention is going to save us, or this kind of policy action is going to save us. It's far too massive and far too complicated a problem to solve with just one approach or one solution. And so we're going to have to get down to quite tiny slices of the pie and focus on shrinking those slices as well, because we just won't be able to make the progress necessary in any one sector. It's going to require us to focus on all sectors, no matter how small.
So, since I'm visiting my granddaughter back east, and we're on tape today, David Wallace-Wells, she just turned 3. So, give us a picture of what the world will look like when she's about 30 years old, which is, I take it, when you think we reach the point of no return.
Well, I think it's probably around the time when we'll be at about 2 degrees or a little north of 2 degrees of warming by mid-century. And that is if we don't take dramatic action and we kind of continue on the course we're on. It's also possible that we take some amount of action, which will mean that we'll still end up at 2 degrees or north of 2 degrees, but not as soon as 2050. So let's just talk about that temperature rise. At say 2.5 degrees, we will have begun the irreversible melt of some of the world's biggest ice sheets, which over time, it'll take centuries, but over time could raise sea levels hundreds of feet, several hundred feet. We would have, according to the UN, at least 200 million climate refugees, possibly as many as 1 billion climate refugees. That's as many people as live in North and South America combined. We would have many cities in South Asia and the Middle East that would be literally unlivable during summer, that you couldn't go outside, you certainly couldn't work outside without risking heat stroke and possibly death. Some of these cities now house 10, 12, 15 million people, and they would be, practically speaking, uninhabitable for parts of the year. Now, we have some time to adjust to these changes. They're not going to happen overnight, and so it's not as though there's like one door is open and then suddenly it's shut and we're in a whole different world. That's not how climate works. It's not binary. It unfolds slowly over time, and we will adjust accordingly. But if we get to a place in 2050 where whole parts of the Middle East and South Asia are, practically speaking, uninhabitable, that will really have a dramatic impact on our global politics and our economies. And I don't think we can sort of walk blithely into that situation assuming that it will work itself out. Even if it is the case that some features of it will work out, we will continue to have something like civilization. We will continue to have something like recognizable forms of modern life, but they will be so transformed by these forces that looking at them from the vantage of today, we might not even recognize them. And that's really the sort of central subject of my book, not just what's going to happen to us, but not just what climate change is going to do, what it promises, what is coming down the pike, what is scheduled to happen, but what it will mean for the way that we all live together on this planet, how we will organize our lives, where we will look for meaning, how we will understand ourselves in relation to nature, how we will understand ourselves in history. And I think there are some real profound changes on those fronts to come. I think it's a whole area of inquiry. I think of it as kind of the humanities of climate change that really hasn't been explored yet. And I think some of those impacts will be more profound even than the direct impacts of climate change.
So when would the ocean be lapping at the doorsteps of Mar-a-Lago down in Florida?
Well, I think those risks are actually quite around the corner. I mean, most of South Florida is really low-lying and really vulnerable to sea level rise. I think that those lands are unlikely to be livable at some point in the second half of the century. I think it's going to require that little sea level rise. Now, there are some accommodations we can make. There's some protections we can build. We can build seawalls. We can move people off the coast because, again, it's not something that one day you're going to wake up and a whole city that was above water is suddenly underwater. But all of that infrastructure building is really expensive. And frankly, since it's happening everywhere in the world, it will require prioritization and sort of rationing of resources. And that raises another big question, which is climate change is universal. It will affect all of us. It will affect all of our lives, but it also affects us unequally. Its impacts are distributed unequally, and unfortunately, resources will be distributed unequally too, which means that those most in need, the global poor, the global south, are likely to be even worse off, relatively speaking, 50 years from now than they are today, because those of us living in the relatively affluent corners of the world will be able to do some things, probably a lot of things, to protect ourselves. But those people living in the equatorial band of the world, in the low-lying regions in, say, India and Bangladesh, will be able to do much less. And exactly how that opens up onto the geopolitical stage, I don't know for sure, but I would not at all be surprised if there were major calls for climate reparations and that kind of negotiation over who owes what to whom, who will pay for what kinds of protections, and who's responsible for the immense, probably unprecedented suffering that we're likely to see over the course of the century as climate change really begins to unfold.
And of course, what's so scary about the process of climate change is that it's self-reinforcing. It accelerates. In other words, as the more the Arctic and Antarctic ice melts, the less light is reflected back out into the atmosphere from the white snow to the dark ocean, then increases. And then the tundra, of course, melts and releases more methane, which is the most pernicious of global warming gases. So that is unfortunately how it is in terms of science. It accelerates. So just in the last minute, let's talk briefly about the example you give in your book about how Syria, that country that's literally died before our eyes, is in many ways an example of what happens with global warming, because global warming did play a part in the disintegration of that country.
Yeah, the civil war that took place a few years ago in Syria was not, everybody's careful to say it was not caused in a simplistic way by climate change, but climate change was a factor because it was a drought that produced a kind of famine that led to civil unrest and war. And, you can look next door at Lebanon. They went through similar climate conditions and they didn't have a civil war. But my perspective on this is that if climate change makes some event more likely, it's sort of dismissive to say that it was not a cause. So I think it's quite fair to say that that it's not that civil war was caused by climate change to some degree. It produced a refugee crisis. 12 million people left the country. 1 million went to Europe, and that 1 million in Europe really destabilized all of European politics. I think it played a role in Brexit, and you could even say it's played a role in the election of Donald Trump because it's had such a cascading impact through our global politics. The UN says that we're likely to see a climate crisis that's at least 100, perhaps 200, perhaps 1,000 times as big as that over the next few decades. And just what that will mean for the way that we all live together, I think we don't know yet, but it's clear that the impacts will be profound, and it's important for us to look seriously at the science and think seriously about what it will mean for the way that we live together.
Well, David Wallace-Wells, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with David Wallace-Wells, who's a National Fellow at the New America Foundation and a columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine. He was previously the deputy editor of the Paris Review, and his latest book just out is The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming.